The first thing I want to talk about with annotation is just the purpose of causing yourself to slow down by actually writing in your book. I remember when I was in high school and very soon after, I never wrote in my books. I sort of treated books as these holy relics almost. And I thought it was so strange to take a book and to bend it, to fold it, to scribble inside of. It felt like I was ruining something that was intended for a particular purpose, and I was just thrusting that aside and making it my own. And that felt really weird to me to even just begin writing inside of a book. But obviously, over time, especially once you enter college, it becomes so necessary to actually dive in and engage with what it is that you're reading, to take the reading from something passive into something very much active, and to see how much more engagement that brings out from what it is that you're consuming. And with writing in a book, one of the first things that I noticed when I began to actually start annotating inside my books is that it gives me pause from time to time, and it forces me to make considerations that I wouldn't have otherwise made when I was just reading regularly. So before, when I would just read casually and just sift through the text, I wasn't really sifting through anything. What was happening is I'm just swallowing up whatever's coming at me and then just taking it wholesale and maybe thinking about it later. But when you have just the goal of thinking to yourself, okay, I'm going to write in this book, what I think it adds to the experience is it gives you this feeling of, okay, I'm going to be thinking the whole time about what I want to most attend to, what matters about what it is that I'm reading, and what is going to matter to the future version of me that wants to look back at this text. And that is a really nice mindset to get into for actually taking the text seriously and starting to study it as something that's going to be integrated into your own life. And that was one of the biggest differences I noticed when I first started actually not treating the text as something holy and perfectly refined, but treating it as something that I was going to work with and something that was going to be part of who I am, that I was going to be contributing to this thing. I think that was one of the first mental shifts that had to happen when I started annotating my own books. And from there, the very beginning of annotation for me, I think, started fairly clumsily, and that was just highlighting the text, right? I think this is how a lot of people start with annotating books, is they just mark off the different spots. It's like, oh, they see something that grabs their attention, they see something kind of exciting or something that stands out, something that they want to remember, and they just highlight it, right? And that's how I started. That was the bulk of my annotation style for a long time, was just reading and, enjoying it, taking it in, and then deciding, okay, aha, that's a moment I want to remember, and then you highlight it. What I realized over time, first off, the highlights uh, look uglier as time passes. There's a kind of darkening orange that can take over with some highlights, or there's the opposite where the highlighter will actually start to fade over time. In either case, once time had passed and I started to look back at these books that I had highlighted so readily, it suddenly looked like muddy text and was just from the outset unappealing aesthetically, just in terms of how it looked. So that was something interesting that I noticed about highlighting, was just it was making the books uglier in a way. But the most important thing that I started to notice was it wasn't organizing the information in any significant way. What it was doing was just taking the bulk of the text and just subdividing it without any kind of categorization. It was just merely aha, aha, aha. That's useful in the process of reading. I do think highlighting is very nice in terms of just getting you to focus more. But long term, when you're not organizing the information for yourself, all you're doing is just giving yourself more lines to read. Because when you reopen that book and you have all of these highlights, you don't know which highlights are significant. You don't know what is in those highlights. You're essentially needing to just reread highlight by highlight by highlight in order to find the information that you want to find. And it didn't serve me well in terms of actually understanding what I was reading. I had this feeling very often of reading through a whole book and just loving the significance of the information that I was finding in that book, and then also discovering that I wasn't remembering most of it. And in conversation, trying to explain the ideas in that book, it would get muddled and mixed up, and there would be key pieces of jargon or key elements that I was completely ignoring or incapable of lifting to the top. And so it felt like the highlighting is not enough. The highlighting was making the reading experience far more engaging, but it was not making the recall of that information more viable. But as soon as you have a pen or a pencil, you can actually define what it is that you're marking in a way that you couldn't have done with a highlighter. For instance, in a science book, right? A book that's trying to give you the latest on some discoveries in science, the expectation is there's going to be a wealth of jargon throughout the book. Or if you're reading a philosophy book, you're going to get a lot of jargon. You're going to get a lot of these terms that are defined very often as soon as they're first introduced, and then you're expected to know this throughout the rest of the book. And what's really convenient when you have a pen or a pencil is now you can mark up that term and distinguish it from the rest of the text. So one of the first things that I started to do when I realized this superpower of having a pen or a pencil is I had this defined shape for jargon, for terms. So whenever I saw a word that was defined in the text, I would put a square around it. And by putting that square, I knew as soon as I saw it, okay, that's where that term comes up. And then later on, I started in the margins next to the square, putting the letters D, E, F for definition. And then far later on, I started just putting the word that was defined in the margins and then underlining it. And that would show, okay, this is where those defined terms are. And what this is starting to do is I'm thinking about the book as something that I'm going to flip through again and again over time. And what I'm starting to create for myself is essentially a guide within the book for the key ideas. And so I can organize those ideas so that every time I flip through it, I know exactly where the information I want is going to be. So all of the jargon gets defined with the words on the side margins. I start to consider degrees of significance with ideas. When an idea relates to a topic and it feels really important, I underline it. If it feels like further explanation but slightly less important, I put parentheses around the edge of that information and then just draw a line along the margins. If it is key information, the kind of information where every time I open up a book, I really want to have that information, I will literally put a star on the side. And that is one of those indications to me, to the future me, as I flip through the book, that look, every time you see this star, just reread that. This is something that you want to know, right? Or at least you wanted to know when you marked that star in the margin. And the idea is I'm not just doing what a highlighter does. What a highlighter does is it's just marking up every single thing as equally significant. No, I'm creating degrees of significance now. And it's those degrees of significance that's giving me a sense of what really matters to me. But it's also in the process of reading. And I think this is one of the most important things that happens when you start annotating this way, is in the process of reading, I'm thinking about what is most significant. I'm thinking of the ideas in the text within each chapter in terms of how the writer would have thought about it, right? What are the main topics that this writer's bringing up? What is the main terms that the writer would want the reader to know? I'm marking those down. I'm keeping track of the main topics. And then what is the additional information that's just being added on? Perhaps the less vital information, but perhaps merely just interesting information. And the whole time I'm reading, I'm sort of organizing mentally as I'm going through. It's all about making it something that I can look back later, and every time I flip through, it feels like I'm turning the book into my own kind of journal entry. There's something that I know a lot of readers do, which is they will write in a journal alongside what they read. So they will read something and they will maybe summarize ideas on the side in a separate sheet of paper. This to me feels like I'm doing that as I'm reading. So as I'm reading, I'm organizing it with my own thoughts of how I feel like it's organized, how I feel these ideas are structured and related to each other. And then through those connections, it feels like I'm turning the book into my own journal entry. And it has significantly increased my ability to remember what it is that I'm reading, because it feels almost as if I'm writing with the writer through the text. I'm sort of thinking about what they would have been thinking about as they wrote, and then I'm marking that as I read. Now, there's one more significant thing that I do, which is after every single chapter, I think about the main ideas as I went through. And as I'm going through and I find those main ideas, I often circle them. So like this section is about this, okay, put a circle and mark that down. Sometimes over time, I eventually started to actually just write down the main ideas along the edge of each set of paragraphs or paragraph that main idea is focused on. So then it's just literally just having titles for everything. And again, this increases the quality of the reading, because the whole time I'm thinking, what is the main idea? What is the main idea? What is the main idea? And I'm just trying to capture it as best as I can. At the end of every chapter, I then go to the contents page and I try to make the contents page actually useful. One of the things that's gotten real frustrating about, especially it feels like some of the latest books in the last maybe 20 years, for some reason it felt like a lot of the nonfiction books had really great contents pages, and then over time the contents pages get far more vague or far more headline grabby in terms of they're just summing up the emotional register of the ideas and not really the central ideas in the chapter. And so I go to the contents page and I now list out what are the key ideas that I got out of that chapter. And so what you'll see if you look through my books is a lot of them, the contents page is filled with summations of each and every chapter. And now these are summations for me, so they're just usually keywords or key ideas phrased in such a way that it would just trigger my memory. But it's made it so that these books now are my little study guides. And every time I open it up, I look through the contents page and I think, okay, what are the main ideas here that I want to remember? If I just look at the keywords in the contents, does it bring it to mind? Can I recall exactly what that information was? If it's something that I wanted to remember and I can't recall it, well, that is sort of a test. It's almost like the contents page becomes a series of flashcards where I get to look at the main ideas. And if I can't recall it, then I know the exact page to jump to. So then I can recheck those ideas. And thankfully, when I jump to those pages, it will mark off where the terms are, where the main ideas are, what is the information that matters the most. And even though when you're initially looking through the book, it feels like I'm underlining everything and everything's marked up, it's made it so that it's segmented, so that I look at the contents page, I get the main ideas there. If I need to study more, I go into the book and it's segmented quickly so that I can just recall that information. And it makes it so that the major benefit is that I get to walk past these books, grab them off the shelf, and put myself back into that headspace. And it feels like I'm talking to myself. Here's how this author organizes this information. Now you can consume that information in a productive way again. And that is something that I found so valuable in organizing the information like this. And there's so many little details. Every book is its own kind of thing, where the information in the book might be organized slightly differently depending on different authors. And so I will adapt the way that I mark that information in order to adapt to that kind of organization. Sometimes it's led to using other kinds of shapes. For instance, if I'm looking at a reference book, which has much less space in the margins to mark things, then I would just use the shape of a triangle to mark off where the main ideas are, and then a square to mark off where the definitions are. And it just, again, makes it very quick for me to jump back in. But the point is, I'm turning the book into a map for myself. And the map is cutting out superfluous information that isn't as significant, but it's making it so that when I want to dive deep, when I want to delve down into the landscape of the actual material, I have the mapping there to give me an outline of what to look for. And that is why I annotate in the way that I do. And I hope that all the various images that I embedded throughout this video, I hope they're helpful to you to kind of understand what it is that I'm doing. But I really think that it's improved so much my understanding of and my engagement with the material that I'm reading. And it's made it honestly, genuinely satisfying in a way that it wasn't before. And it's made nonfiction so much more enjoyable for me to engage with because it feels like I'm truly engaging with it. I'm really, really taking the time to try to understand what I'm reading all of the time. And it makes it, although it initially seems tedious and like more work, it makes it way less boring. It makes it just fully encapsulating, like you're just being sucked into the text, and hours can pass and I can just sit there and I'm just writing with the book, and it really, really feels nice. Again, I think I made this point earlier. It feels almost like the book is becoming my own journal of the ideas that I was reading through. Now, I want to make one final point, and this is just about annotating fiction. When I was getting my English degree, I did annotate fiction all of the time. It was required. It was part of conducting a full, detailed literary analysis. You're thinking through all of the broader ideas that were being constructed within the text and all of the ways in which the text is relating with other ideas and some of the symbolism that's contained within that. And reading fiction that way felt very artificial and constructed, and it felt like I was taking out some of the fluidity and perhaps some of the nuance that was in fiction in order to isolate it within the boxes of the ideas that I knew would get me a pretty solid grade from my professor. And it actually turned me off a lot from annotating fiction. So what it might be strange if you were to look through the books on my shelf is anytime you open up nonfiction, it'll be written through the whole way through. And then anytime you open up fiction, even though you would expect me, having had an English degree, to want to mark up fiction all over the place, you'll find that I avoid it because I really just want to sink into the fiction and let it wash over me and just stay in that in-between space where I'm not forcing the text into a kind of box. For me, nonfiction makes sense as a box because it's information. It's sort of registering information and then putting it out there. And the author themselves are trying to organize and segment that information for the reader. And so I'm just rediscovering that segmentation within the nonfiction. But whenever I'm reading fiction, I want to be in that liminal space. I want to just let the gestalt take over and just feel the whole of the thing and not be too consumed by interpreting. I find fiction so private. The thing that matters to me about fiction, I find to be so private. It doesn't matter to me how well I can communicate fiction. It does matter to me how well I can communicate the ideas in nonfiction. But fiction, for me, is something so associative and vitally so, and so personal. I just want to keep it that way. So I don't annotate fiction very much. If I go back to fiction, it's to reread the whole thing. It's not just to jump from segment to segment and remind myself of things. So that is a different kind of mindset that I have for fiction. But obviously, please tell me your ways of doing it. Maybe there's something I can discover about annotating fiction that's outside of what I would have learned when getting an English degree. I feel like the English major way of annotating kind of turned me off to it, that very literary analysis way of thinking about it. If you could give me some ways that you annotate fiction that is outside of that is purely for the joy of it, then please let me know, and maybe even make your own video so I can watch it. That'd be really great. Those are my thoughts on annotating. One thing that I didn't bring up is I don't put tags and stuff on the edges of books. I just haven't found that as useful as writing down the main ideas in the contents page. But if there is a particular way that using those tags on the edge of your books has been helpful in a way that it wouldn't be by just writing in the contents page, please let me know. And that's it. So thanks for watching.